latest edition of the Pro Football Focused The Nickel IDP podcast. I am your host, Walton Surlin, and so happy to have my co-host on board once again this week. And we get to talk about an exciting first week of NFL action. How are you doing, Mr. Ross Miles?
Not doing too badly. I actually watched the Rams win a game of football, which has been a rarity over the last few seasons, and they actually looked like a competent football team, which is something I can't say on a regular basis. So, add in a couple of wins in the fantasy football leagues I'm in this year, and yeah, it was a very enjoyable first week. I'm just glad to be able to talk about real football with meaningful stats and meaningful matchups rather than the preseason.
I'm right there with you. A surprise come from behind victory for my Detroit Lions against the Cardinals, and we'll take that here in Detroit. It's few and far between for a win like that after a horrible start. Apropos for this podcast, it was the defense that really helped the Lions, and of course that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a recap Week 1. We're going to talk about the injuries that could affect your not only your starting lineups but your waiver wire options. And first we'll start off with the game that didn't happen, Ross, and that was due to Hurricane Irma, the postponement of the Miami and Tampa Bay game. And I can tell you right off the top, it helped me win in one of my IDP leagues because the gentleman I was playing had Kiko Alonso, Rashad Jones, someone from Tampa wasn't quite, might have been Levante David. So it definitely affected his lineup, as I'm sure it did a lot of people's.
Yeah, I mean, I'm been a big Rashad Jones supporter for several seasons, so I own him in a few leagues, so that that didn't help at all. But yeah, I mean, it's just an interesting wrinkle in how we're going to be planning for the season now, because obviously this means that Tampa Bay and Miami won't have a bye later in the season when everyone does. I've always thinking about, does that mean players are going to get on a run and keep going, or are they going to need a break? It depends how your form's going. I think sometimes when a team's losing, sometimes it's having a few losses back to back, and then you get the bye week to get your head clear. But that can't happen right now. So if I get the feeling whatever form these guys are in could be exacerbated, be it good or bad.
That's a good point. And remember, people, that game will be played week 11. And just to kind of touch on what Ross was saying there, that's sometimes the bye week can help if players are nicked up. And that's about the time of the season where the wear and tear sets in and teams don't mind having that bye. So that we'll have to see how it plays out. But I believe the league made the right decision.
There's going to be the added wrinkle. Don't Miami come over to London again this year? So no bye week off the back of an international game. That could be interesting to see how they deal with that situation.
Right, I saw where they actually requested from the league to have that game moved back to the States, and of course we're denied. They're not gonna be able to take that game away from London. You folks love your football too much over there.
It's definitely getting a lot bigger in popularity. If I wear a jersey in the street, people will, I get more comments, that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's people who know about me and my NFL fandom and what we do here. More and more people are sort of pricking their ears up, and more people I know are starting to play fantasy. So it's good to see it's spreading.
Exactly, and we're just going to continue in the happy zone for Ross and let him give us the latest. And it's good news, Ross. The latest on the Aaron Donald situation.
Yeah, it was good news. Aaron Donald showed up. He reported for duty, I believe, on Saturday. He was not added. He was still declared out for the game, but all signs seem to be pointing that he will be good to go in week 2. By all accounts, he's kept himself in shape, albeit away from the team, so there shouldn't be any hiccup there. Especially promising is the fact that the Rams looked pretty decent on defense. They were a nightmare for the Colts offensive line. They got to Tulsi numerous times. The sack love was already shared out between different members of that unit. I saw Robert Quinn get one. Walker got one. So putting Donald in the middle as well is going to make that unit even more fearsome. So hopefully a bit more of that going forward.
You can bet defensive coordinator Wade Phillips is very excited to finally have Donald in the fold. And I believe they have, is it the Redskins this week? let me look at me. Yes, they do at home. So that can be an offense that struggles at times. So that's a boost for that defense, and a defense that doesn't really need a boost coming off of their first game, especially the defensive line, and that would be the Jacksonville Jaguars. They laid a smackdown on the Houston Texans to the tune of 10 sacks and 4 turnovers. Let the folks at home and out there in listener land know just who had big weeks for the Jaguars and what that could maybe mean moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, a guy we had talked about in some of our preseason podcasts was Calais Campbell. You highlighted him as a guy who had obviously moved and was arguably the biggest fantasy move on the defensive side of the ball in the entire offseason. And what got us excited was he was moving from a 3-4 to a 4-3 scheme, and we were wondering what that was going to do for his sack totals. Now, for a man who I don't believe has ever had more than 8.5 in an entire season, he recorded 4 sacks in the first game as a Jacksonville Jaguar, adding 6 total tackles as well. It was a bumper fantasy day for Calais Campbell, and I think the proof is in the pudding. He's got to be a double-digit sack guy now. He's only got to get 6 in the rest of the season. On that form, he's going to be way ahead. I still don't think we're going to see him pushing past 15 or anything like that, but I think he looks a lock at the minute for a double-digit sack season with that kind of form.
Right, and like you said, this is double digits, I believe, easily in store. But the matchup also worked out favorably for the Jaguars. What the Texans had been going through the past few weeks, following Hurricane Harvey, and J.J. Watt and all the money he raised. And the big factor is Dwayne Brown is holding out the offensive tackle, so I think the Jaguars were also able to benefit from that. But you can't take anything away from the performance. Even Dante Fowler, he of the off-the-field issues quite a few times. A sack, a forced fumble, and fumble recovery for a touchdown. So that's someone that you have jotted down here in your notes, Ross. And in Ross's article, waiver wire pickups is up today at Pro Football Focus. But Fowler is someone you're going to want to look at. And this next gentleman's name, I'm not all that great at pronouncing. Yannick, you want to take the last name, Ross?
Nagui?
Yeah, that works for me.
Nagakui, maybe.
Yeah, I'll take that.
Again, but it's interesting. They both had similar days, and slightly edging it for Nagakui. 4 total tackles, 2 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, and a fumble recovery. Obviously, Fowler's fumble recovery for a touchdown puts him back on a level. But we need to dive a little bit deeper if we're going to try and pick between the two. And it looked to me like it was Nagakui who was on the field more. He actually rushed the passer 31 times compared to Fowler's 24, and he was more productive when he was doing so. He added 5 hurries to his 2 sacks, whereas Fowler only added 2 hurries to his 1 sack. So if you have to choose between the two, even though Fowler's arguably the sexier name, being the higher draft pick, I would say Yannick's your man. But it's a coin flip, really. But if I had to, gun to head, I'd take Nagakui.
I agree completely. Now, next week the Jaguars, I believe, had another division game against the Tennessee Titans. So they'll be looking to get after Marcus Mariota and company. And there were actually quite a few 2-sack performances in the opening weekend. Some names, that were expected. I think there's one on here that he managed to clinch the game with his. And go ahead and talk a little bit about some of our defensive linemen that stepped up and got us the 2 sacks that fantasy IDP owners love to have.
Yeah, it was obviously great to have a multi-sack day, and there was several people that did so. Brooks Reed, obviously, he's the guy you were hinting at with his game-winning sack of Mike Glennon to get Atlanta home over the line. That was a pretty big one for him. So that was a good performance. I still don't think Reed is really rosterable unless you're playing in some really deep league. Probably maybe starting 4 linebackers, as many as that, or have really rewarding systems for outside linebackers, so sacks. But so big play leagues maybe. But I still think he's a guy you're going to leave on there. Hakeem Hicks is a guy who flirts with fantasy relevance. He had a 2 sack performance day. I think for me, it's the days like this where you wish you started him, but most of the time when he's going to do this, he's going to be riding the pine, unfortunately, for your fantasy team. Names that we did expect bigger things from this season were definitely going to be Trey Flowers and Brandon Graham. Now, both of those guys, obviously being in this little section, had 2 sacks. Now, Flowers is particularly of note. We've kind of been waiting for him to break out. We talked about him a little bit in the offseason. We suggested we thought he was going to be a DL2, maybe could push a bit higher on a New England team that normally has high sack numbers. So that was good to see that confirmed, at least on a 1 game perspective. And then, we've talked about the scheme change again not San Diego, in LA for the Chargers rather than the Rams. And it was good to see Bosa and Ingram both racked up multi-sack days, although it was 1.5 each rather than 2. So it was pleasant to see some of our theories being confirmed. Like we said, Calais Campbell big day, Bosa and Ingram both productive, Trey Flowers making strides forwards. But there's another guy who I think we might want to talk about a little bit in Dallas.
Yeah, DeMarcus Lawrence. When he's not suspended, he's definitely, or injured. He's had back issues in the past. He's flashed the ability to get to the quarterback, and that's something Dallas sorely needs. And he comes through with 2 sacks. And once again, as somebody probably on your waiver wire, just because they said he's missed multiple games for the past few seasons. Again, like I said, he's flashed. Maybe 2 and 3 games at a time where he's been. You hear his name. He's getting close to the quarterback. Maybe 1.5 sacks. But this is a really good start for a guy that's probably, again, DeMarcus Lawrence on your waiver wire.
Yeah, I mean, he's a guy that piques my interest mainly because that Dallas team is a dangerous one. It's it's going to put the pressure on when they're on offense. Dak Prescott's a capable quarterback. Des Bryant's going to stretch the field, and they've obviously got Zeke as well to pound the rock. So teams are gonna find it tough to live with the Cowboys, and they're going to have to pass, and that's going to give someone like Lawrence a chance to pin his ears back. And I think when we're looking for guys that are going to step up, especially for fantasy purposes, we want to talk about 10+ sack seasons. And Lawrence's performance week 1 to me signified that he could achieve that. So I'm going to probably slide down my fantasy rankings a little bit, and I would recommend picking him up if he is on your waiver wire.
Yeah, that'd be the prudent move, and I agree in my rankings. He probably will see a bit of a boost, maybe Trey Flowers as well. And I agree with Brooks Reed. I think he can still be hands off there. And if you started him this week, then you should be on the show with us, because I'm guessing he wasn't in a lot of lineups. And speaking of lineups, tell you what, there were a lot of linebackers that had very big games to open the season, and a few of them you'll recognize from our previous podcasts that we've touched on, and some other ones kind of came out of nowhere. So let's go back to Jacksonville and talk about somebody who's a real good waiver wire pickup. And this is where, when maybe some of our advice to watch the preseason or listen to what's going on in the preseason, maybe in press conferences or lineups. Well, none of that lined up well for this player, as he appeared to be kind of moved out of the limelight, and then out of nowhere, things changed. Talk a little bit about the linebacker we want off the waiver wire from the Jaguars.
Yeah, indeed. Myles Jack was actually manning the field in an every down role alongside Telvin Smith, which is, as you hinted at, contrary to what we were told all preseason, that Paul Posluszny was still going to play that role. 79 of 79 snaps, 14 total tackles was a big day for Myles Jack. He is going to see a flip-flopping of his fantasy value. I mean, Pos for me was, in the 20s, low 20s, maybe pushing into the teens, so an LB2. And Jack was sitting, just outside the top 40, I think. But, with what we saw, Posluszny only being on the field for 8 snaps, you're going to have to flip them. Again, Jack, for me, I don't really want to push him quite further up into sort of really fringe LB1 territory quite yet. But, a few more 14 total tackle days, and I may well be doing so. He is definitely someone to target on the waiver wire this week.
Yeah, he'd be a great pickup, and you make a very good point about, let's not jump the gun and start, trying to trade your Alec Ogletree for Myles Jack because of the week that Jack had. This is the beginning of the year, and this is where I like to do my annual. Be patient with your studs. You drafted them high for a reason. We didn't get a chance to see Quan, as we mentioned earlier. Alec Ogletree didn't have a great week.
It's interesting you mentioned that because he only was on the field for 41 snaps, or might have been 44. The problem being the Rams' offense was, moving the ball quite well, and once we were significantly ahead, we took the starters out of the game on offense and defense. So, the fact that the Rams played well, I don't see that being a trend for Ogletree. Just purely because the Rams will make some offensive mistakes and the defense will have to make plays, and they will be on the field. So for me, I think that it's a little bit of an anomaly on Ogletree. If you can buy low on him for some reason, I definitely think it's a wise move.
Right. It's always good to be aware of game situations and to dig a little deeper, as Ross just did, and find out the reasons why somebody didn't play as many snaps as normal, or maybe their stat totals are down. And it could end up being that the Indianapolis Colts are a team that just aren't good matchups for linebackers. Again, because I think until they get Andrew Luck back, they're going to have a lot of games like they had against the Rams. So it's, like I said, it's good to be patient with your studs early in the year. And speaking of studs, let's talk about B.J. Goodson of the New York Giants. We were banging the B.J. Goodson drum pretty loudly in our linebacker preview, and he certainly made a splash in his first game as the starter.
Yes, he certainly did. 18 total tackles, 14 of them being solo, will get your name recognised. I believe he'll probably be sitting atop the linebacker rankings, at least after the first week, in most scoring formats. So someone that we had heard rumours about, the coaches were talking positively about him. They were anointing him the leader of the defense, or at least playing that kind of role, taking responsibility, not leaving the field. And he's put up a big score for his owners. One caveat being, we're talking about certain matchups being beneficial. I think, we're saying that maybe the Colts, could potentially be a bad matchup for linebackers. The Cowboys are going to be the polar opposite. As long as Zeke Elliott's on the field still, they're going to run the ball, and they're going to be quite happy to pound it and pound it and pound it, and that's going to mean great things for your middle linebackers.
Yep, that's a good point. And also, again, speaking of game situations, or again maybe why the numbers are the way they were. If you watch that game, the Cowboys' offense was on the field a lot. I mean, the Giants' offense did nothing in the first half, did very little for the entire game. I believe the stat was at halftime of that game, the Giants' defense had been on the field for 47 snaps. So if you're going to be on the field that much, hey, we'll take those numbers from Goodson, but Giants fans have to be a little concerned. It's the way that offense looked. I know they're waiting for Odell Beckham back, but that was something. And speaking of, go ahead.
I was going to say, I just checked the numbers. Goodson just played 74 snaps last week.
That's a pretty good amount. And
yes.
But again, we'll take those totals. And tell you what, it was a big week for a Watt. But it wasn't JJ. JJ's younger brother kind of burst onto the scene for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Talk a little bit about the week TJ had and maybe what we can expect moving forward from him.
Yeah, it was a really pleasant surprise. It's one of those. It's always in fantasy. I find you get certain outside linebackers in those systems where you like the player, you think they're a good player, but they're difficult to own for fantasy purposes because of the scoring system, of the way that outside linebackers struggle to accumulate enough points. But TJ Watt led the team in tackles this week with 7, 6 of them solo, and then added 2 sacks and interception to his money as well. So pretty impressive performance, like you say. Obviously we can't be expecting 3 splash plays in every single week for him. But I think this is a guy you should be picking up, even in normal scoring systems. Just keep him on the edge of your roster. I'd rather have him on my team than let someone else have him. You don't necessarily have to play him. He can be a spot start for you. If you have a tough matchup from one of your more consistent, tackle heavy linebackers, You like this matchup. You think he might get a sack. You can always throw him in. And heck, if he can keep up, 6, 7 tackle performances and add a sack in, every now and then, he could have another coming of Khalil Mack.
Right, and let's face it, he's got that Watt blood flowing through him. So that's a family that knows how to get after the quarterback and how to get to the football. So that is definitely a name you want to pluck off that waiver wire. And some names that we expected good games from came through for us. Maybe let's call them old reliables and maybe a couple of new reliables. But, C.J. Mosley, 8 total tackles and a pick 6. And, he's a quarter of the way to his interception total from last year. So you probably drafted him high and you're happy you played him.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I'm always a fan of linebackers who can make interceptions. That's always, for me, linebackers who can pick the ball out of the air. It's like it's a stat or some points I'm not normally expecting from those guys. You want a handful of sacks, you're expecting some forced fumbles, but if the guys can chuck in, like you say, 3 or 4 interceptions as well, it really pushes them into the upper echelon. And Mosley's a guy who had been pegged to be a top end linebacker 1 all the way back in from his rookie season, and he's certainly delivering on that promise. And talking about linebackers that we expect to be linebacker 1s early in their career, I believe your man in Detroit had a decent game as well.
Yes, he did. Jarrad Davis, and I was a little concerned with him heading into this game. Just the way he was exploited by the Patriots in coverage, and I worried whether the Lions were get cold feet and keep him out there for all 3 downs. Well, they certainly did, and while he did have a interference in the end zone, pass interference in the end zone penalty, like he was pretty much face guarding, but he looked decent in coverage. Finished with 9 total tackles and a fumble recovery, and more importantly, played 100% of the snaps. And as I mentioned when we talked about both of our favorite teams winning, the Lions defense, they made quite a few splash plays. He's the leader of that defense, and it's going to be interesting to see and watch and fun to see this kid develop as he does get better in coverage. And it's obviously the team's going to give him the rope to do that, and it's just exciting times for Lions fans, at least defensively, and Jets fans have to be a little bit excited about something. It's certainly not going to be their offense, but a young linebacker that we spoke about in the previous podcast stepped up and had a nice week, and a returning to New York linebacker had a pretty good week for us. Talk a little bit about the Jets linebacking situation.
Yeah, Darren Lee, 10 tail tackles and a sack. It was interesting to note because obviously when we were talking about this guy being, pushing on towards linebacker 1 territory, just consolidating as a linebacker 2, there was a fair bit of conjecture and projection in that because he hadn't fully played an every down role, and he didn't. He didn't in week 1. He only played 64 of 77 snaps, so that is worth sort of bearing in mind when you're considering Lee. If you're in a league which is a little bit shallower, perhaps when you start a couple of linebackers, Lee might be the kind of guy who you can grab off the waiver wire. I would recommend doing so because I see him potentially moving into an every down role, but it's worth noting that he wasn't in week 1. But Demario Davis, him of the failing to deliver on his promise, 14 total tackles and half a sack in week 1. He was on the field for every snap. That was interesting to note. They haven't fully passed the torch yet to Lee from Davis.
Right, and this is another quick note on that is just take note of who they played in week 1, and that would have been the Buffalo Bills. So we keep an eye on Buffalo. This week, let's see what kind of tackle totals they give up to linebackers. Again, just as you mentioned that Dallas is a nice matchup for linebackers. Maybe we're finding another one with the Bills. That's just something to keep an eye on. And another quick note, we talked him up in the preseason, Jatavius Brown of the Chargers, 14 total tackles, 11 solo. I think he delivered on kind of the accolades we were giving him.
He did. I mean, there seems this year to have been like a little cluster of guys in the kind of the top half of the LB2 tier. Could maybe shove in Christian Kirksey and Bernardrick McKinney and Jatavius Brown. To me, I'd have them in a similar sort of window of where I expect them to perform, and I'm wondering which ones are going to step up. And Brown's 11 solos and 14 tail tackles in week 1 puts him in the driving seat among those three to really kick on and maybe, push into that LB1 territory if some of the guys above him don't quite live up to expectations.
Right. Yep. And again, spoke about Brown in previous podcasts, so hopefully you've been listening. And we're going to take a quick look at some three down linebackers, which is obviously what IDP owners covet. You want your guy out there every play. I mentioned it talking about Jarrad Davis. And these are some names to keep an eye on as the season plays out. And if they're three downs, you want them in your lineups. Ross, go ahead and talk about the three down linebackers to watch.
Yeah, obviously, the main guys we all kind of have a pretty good handle on. Your Luke Kuechly's and your Alec Ogletrees of the league. We know who they are. We know they're in three down roles. But what we're trying to do here is just identify guys who are in maybe playing more snaps than we could have potentially expected, or guys who might be sneaky point returns. If you're struggling for a backup or you really need a third starter and you're looking for value on the waiver wire, these are the kind of guys you want to be paying attention to. So, number one, Kyle Van Noy. He played all 68 snaps in New England as the middle linebacker. Interesting because Donta Hightower was the one passed over there. So he's a guy you might want to sort of, I'm not saying necessarily pick him up straight away, but he's one you should keep on the radar, maybe on the watch list. Another guy to keep an eye on would be Nick Vigil in Cincinnati. Now, he played 65 out of 66 snaps, but the caveat with him is we think he is going to be the guy who loses out when Vontaze Burfict returns. I believe his suspension's been reduced down to 3 games from the initial 5. So if you want to cash in on a bit of quick value or as a spot start for these first 3 weeks, if you are a Burfict owner, it's definitely Nick Vigil as the guy you want to grab there.
Yep, that's it. And Vincent Ray also, had a good game. He had 11 total tackles for Cincinnati. So as you mentioned, those are likely to change when Burfict returns. And also keep in mind that these are the kind of numbers that could be waiting for Burfict when he does return. So as long as he can keep his head on as straight as possible and not get suspended again or hurt, Burfict when he comes back, that's going to be somebody we want to have. And I think an interesting name, and because this is a player that the Lions didn't bring back after he was on the team, I believe it was last year. John Bostic for the Colts, 65 of 65 snaps. That I got to admit, that surprised me because he has bounced around since I believe being drafted, was it by the Bears?
Yeah, he was drafted by the Bears. He's an interesting one because I think he's a little bit undersized, and he kind of seemed a little bit more. He came across as someone who tried to lay the hit, but maybe couldn't quite live up to that in the NFL because he's a smaller guy. There was a lot of, if we were looking in Indianapolis, we were probably fancying Antonio Morrison to be the guy they went to. He only played 57 of the 65 snaps, so Bostic is the guy they were favouring in week 1. Interesting to note, again, I'd have him as a watch list player rather than an immediate go and grab.
Right. Let's see if he can maintain that role because, as we said, he has struggled to even stay on teams in the past. So, he's a wait and see, but keep an eye on. And we also like that both Zach Brown and Mason Foster were played all 69 snaps on defense for Washington. I think Brown finished with double-digit tackles. I think ended up with 7 solos, 5 assists, 12 total. Names that you want to have starting as long as you're going to be out there for 3 downs.
Yeah, I think there was a little bit of conflict in the preseason about maybe one of these guys would take a more senior role. Neither of them have really been absolute studs for fantasy purposes, but they have had their times as linebacker 2s that could do a job. And I felt like this preseason, both of them were people were worried they were going to eat into each other, and we weren't sure which one was going to be dominant. But week 1, as they both played 100 snaps and 100% of snaps and had fairly decent fantasy returns. So keep an eye on both. I'd probably have one of these 2 guys, if not both, as the top picks out of these guys we've mentioned so far in this little 3-down section.
I completely agree with that. And that's going to move us to the defensive back position, And Ross makes a very good note in our game notes, or podcast notes, that the DB position ranks are heavily skewed to favor players with interceptions over the first few weeks. So, Yeah, be very careful when you're watching the waiver wire to look at the stat lines and see how they accumulated the points, because interceptions can't be counted on a weekly basis. So it's really important to to see how they accumulated their points. Otherwise, you just end up chasing ghosts. And talk about some of the top defensive backs that stood out to you this week.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're talking about why interceptions are going to be overvalued. Well, Tremaine Johnson, a Rams cornerback, made a pick six, also caused a fumble and recovered it, as well as making just 2 tackles. But he's arguably going to be the top defensive back in most fantasy leagues because of scoring systems, because of that pick six and those 2 other splash plays. So 2 total tackles, and he's somehow going to top fantasy rankings in week 1. So that's what we're talking about, really. I've got nothing against Tremaine Johnson. He's actually a viable starter at cornerback in cornerback required leagues. But if you're making a gut reaction play based on the fact that you've an Eric Berry owner, for example, he's got injured for the rest of the season, and you've just logged in and you've looked at who's top of your fantasy score charts, Tremaine Johnson may well be, and he's someone you shouldn't be overpaying for.
Yep, that's the thing. And the next person on this list that we're going to talk about is somebody who I'll admit that I tend to overlook, and he came out in week 1, had a very good game. Safety Devin McCourty of the Patriots, 10 total tackles and a fumble recovery. And there's a good chance he's on the waiver wire. He's always been a solid player, and for some reason, for fantasy purposes, I haven't been totally on board, even as a bye week filler. But McCourty came out of the gates pretty strong, Ross.
He did. Now, McCourty's a guy for me who's had seasons when he's made enough interceptions to be fantasy relevant. But when he doesn't have 4 or 5 interceptions, I think he sometimes struggles to put up the tackle numbers to really be someone you want to own in fantasy circles. So that's my issue with McCourty. So I'd have him on the watch list. He's not a pickup, but he's a watch list guy for me.
Agreed. I can't argue with that. And in Arizona, a couple of veterans maybe flip-flop from how we thought they would perform. Tyvon Branch had 10 total tackles, and he played 71 snaps. And I believe quite a few of those snaps ended up being at the free safety position, where he was being listed at cornerback and on a lot of sites. But then also Antoine Bethea only played 60 snaps. So is this a situation to be concerned about for Bethea owners?
Quite potentially. It's an interesting one. Obviously, we know that the Cardinals defense, they run some exotic nickel-esque packages, obviously they've got a very talented defensive backs unit, so they want to get as many on the field as they can, because obviously they've got Tyrann Mathieu as well. Tyrann Mathieu played 71 snaps, so did Branch, so Bethea only saw 60. 10 total tackles is what Branch turned it into. Now, he's a guy who's also managed to throw in splash plays throughout his career when he's been healthy. He's one of those kind of safeties who can push into triple digits in the right scheme, although we might be going back a few years to when he still had knees. But, I still have a bit of a soft spot for him, so I'll be monitoring his situation. He is someone I think that I would go as far to grab off the waiver wire, but I'd be quite happy to drop him again quickly. He's one of those where I think we'll know quite soon, by the next couple of weeks, whether it's one to stick with.
Yep, watch it play out. To keep an eye on the snap counts and how the Cardinals utilize the veterans. Speaking of veterans, Earl Thomas, who we didn't give a whole lot of love to in our preseason preview, comes out and gets 11 total tackles. Is this something that the IDP owner should chase on the waiver wire if he wasn't drafted, or is this just one of those rare weeks where Earl Thomas put up a lot of tackles?
I think I'm just going to reiterate the conversation we had last week when we were doing the defensive back section, and we were talking about never overdraft people at defensive back and don't go for just the big names like Earl Thomas. And we said maybe Earl Thomas, coming off his leg injury, may see more targets than he usually would for the first couple of weeks while people test him out, and that bumps his fantasy value. And I think that's what we could be seeing here, 11 total tackles. Again, I wouldn't want to commit too much of my budget if you're in a free agency budget league where you have to bid your coins. I would keep them and go cheap on Thomas. But if you can pick him up for free, I think it's worth a roll of a dice, because if he has another couple of good weeks, I think that his name recognition makes him valuable to other people who are less knowledgeable. I do think when people fully realise that the real Earl Thomas is back playing football, I think his targets and his production will drop.
Right, use it. If you can sell high on a player, especially Thomas, for the reasons you mentioned, do so. In Baltimore, Tony Jefferson, comes over from Arizona and does what Tony Jefferson does, puts up double digit total tackles and throws in a sack. He's just been a good weekend start for the last couple of years.
He has. And if any of you are playing in cornerback required leagues, a couple of guys you might want to take a look at. They could be on the waiver wire. Had decent games. Trey Waynes, for a former first round safety cornerback in Minnesota, 10 total tackles. He was targeted 8 times and allowed all 8 passes for 90 yards and a touchdown. If you're going to allow those kind of numbers, people are going to keep throwing at you, so he's going to get more opportunities. And then in Detroit, Jalen Mills, 9 total tackles and an interception. He was targeted 15 times. Sorry, is he? I said Detroit. Is he Philadelphia?
I believe it is Jalen. Yeah, Philadelphia.
So he allowed 10 for 15 for 108. So again, he's someone who I think, based on the fact he's, the team he's on, I think he's going to see targets, and he may well put up more stats like this going forward.
Right, and a side note on Trey Waynes, he's also playing opposite Xavier Rhodes, so teams are probably going to look to avoid Rhodes. Trey Waynes went to Michigan State. I'm a big Michigan State fan, but they're going to keep throwing at him because he definitely struggles. But hey, we'll take those tackle numbers. Hey, Ross, before we touch on injuries, go ahead and do a quick data dive into the defensive backs. Some numbers that people will want to know moving forward, and this could help them on waiver wires or just setting their starting lineups.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, last week we talked about how you can often find good value at defensive back in sneaky ways. You don't need to be chasing those high-profile players. So one of the things we like to do is look about how defensive backs are being used, namely the safeties, which ones are getting close to the line of scrimmage. Now, just through week one, Jamal Adams, the Jets rookie, he played 35 snaps within 8 yards of the line of scrimmage, which was actually 90% of the times he was on the field for a run defensive play. That was by far the most in the league in week one. I don't think anyone else had more than 26 snaps. And interestingly, a player we kind of pointed you guys towards, Eric Reed, he actually had 25 snaps within 8 yards of line of scrimmage. So Wally's assertion that he is going to get to do what he wanted to do and sit in the box a little bit more could well be coming true. So keep an eye on that. And obviously we're expecting Adams to get a few more points moving forward as well. Another thing we like about defensive backs is those who are asked to blitz. We talked about how maybe we thought the Browns were going to be a team that sent a lot of pressure from the defensive back position with Greg Williams in charge. Well, week one, it was Malcolm Jenkins and the Patriots safety, Jordan Richards. They both blitzed 7 times, which led the league. So Richards is a guy I think might be worth as a sneaky add on the waiver wire, just watching what the Patriots do moving forward. If he's going to be used as almost like a designated blitzer in certain dime and nickel packages, he could offer a little bit of niche fantasy value. And then again, we talked about targets for the cornerbacks, Trey Waynes and Jalen Mills. Part of the reason Devin McCourty had such a good day was he saw 8 targets. Unfortunately for him, he allowed 6 for 124 yards and 2 touchdowns. His 8 targets, 6 receptions allowed 124 yards and 2 touchdowns were all league highs in week one. So based on that kind of form, he could continue his run of decent fantasy days if he keeps on performing, with mediocrity and gets targets in his general direction.
Right. Yeah. There's a reason he had those 10 total tackles, but he's going to be out there. So and teams are going to see what we just talked about. That's someone that can be exploited perhaps in coverage. So they'll throw at him and they'll get some points. Before we move on to injuries, and I just jotted down because I don't know what's going on here, Ross. I'm wondering if you have any insight in this. For some reason, Von Bell of the New Orleans Saints only played 7 snaps last night. I did not see that coming, and I was just wondering if I missed something. Marcus Williams played 63 snaps.
Funnily enough, I watched the game with a friend who had Von Bell starting for him in 2 leagues, and he was asking me the very same question, and I didn't have an answer for him last night, and I don't have an answer for you right now. He was a little bit shocked, and he was looking to make some waiver wire moves, so we did discuss a few potential targets, but yeah, it was not what we expected from the Saints. So we need to dig a little bit deeper, see what the beat writers are shaking out for us, see what is being said down in New Orleans.
I'll definitely be looking into that myself because, yeah, I have him in quite a few leagues. All right, let's quickly go through some of the injuries, one of the bigger ones, and you hate to see it to somebody that's battled back through everything he has. But Eric Berry is out for the season. I believe it was actually, wasn't his Achilles that he ended up blowing his Achilles out in the first game? Either way, he's out for the season, and that's a tough break for fantasy owners and the Chiefs.
It is. Berry's a player I've got a lot of love for, and he was having a great game. Gronk had 30 yards until Berry got injured, I believe. So that's all you need to know. That was probably a lot of a long way to part of the reason why that New England was struggling. When you take out, you lose one of your primary receivers in Edelman, and then you take another one away by putting Eric Berry on him, and it changes the way you play football.
Exactly. Quickly, I say a name to keep in mind there is as a possible replacement, Daniel Sorensen. He may step in. He's a big, lanky, athletic guy. We'll have to keep an eye to see if his role increases with Berry out. It happened so late in the game; it was really hard to see, exactly how they might do it. Rookie Myles Garrett suffered a high ankle sprain. He missed week 1. I talked about Ziggy Ansah suffering one in the first week last year, and it affected him all season long. So we probably expect him to miss maybe a game or two more, Ross.
I think so. I mean, generally speaking, high ankle sprains aren't quick fixes. You generally have to rest on them. I don't. We haven't. They're being very coy about his position. So I don't think we've even had the release on the grade of high ankle sprain yet. So you're definitely going to have to monitor the news sources and keep tabs on our Twitter accounts, and we'll keep you updated on Myles Garrett's situation. But I'd be saying probably week 3 or later before we see him now.
Yeah, and another player we're expecting big things from, we're going to have to wait a few weeks to see if he can produce those numbers. Strong safety Jonathan Cyprien, newly signed by the Titans. He's going to miss a few weeks with a hamstring injury, and so we're going to have to wait and see. And I believe a player that you mentioned in your IDP waiver wire, Kevin Byard, plays for the Titans. This could probably help him, as well as Denor Searcy.
Yeah, I think Bayard is a guy who performed, solidly this week. I think he's got an opportunity to continue producing those kind of numbers. I think Searcy is going to be the short-term beneficiary by getting on the field. For me, I've been a relative fan of Donoris Searcy over multiple seasons. To push for him in Buffalo to get more action and get on the field, but he's never quite done it for me. So I don't see any issue with Cyprian returning and getting his job back.
Right. This, hopefully that's not one of those hamstring that lingers all year long, and that when he comes back, he's good to go. Because when he's good to go, he racks up fantasy totals for us. In Chicago, veteran inside linebacker Jarrell Freeman, I believe he's in the concussion protocol, and also has a pectoral injury. So he's, I think, officially questionable for week 2. But the way they treat concussions now, it's going to be tough for him to get back in time.
Yes, concussion is being taken very seriously this year. They're throwing the pectoral injury, and it's difficult to see why they're going to risk Jarrell Freeman in week 2. This is a 17-week regular season, hopefully more for for multiple teams, and it's safer just to keep the guy on the sideline. So you'll be looking for other options if you're a Freeman owner in week 2.
Exactly. Perhaps a name to keep in mind. Is it Nick Kwiatkowski? I know he filled in last year when the Bears were dealing with some injuries. And another final person we'll talk about. Well, let me throw in real quick that we didn't have on a note. Stephon Tuitt from the Steelers defensive end maybe dodged a bullet. It's not a torn biceps, the last I read, so he's only week to week. But then the final guys. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't put Tuitt down because the news I had been seeing suggested he was going to be okay. It could be a week thing, but the initial seriousness of the situation wasn't warranting like a consideration of looking for replacements, at least if you own him.
Oh, you don't need a replacement. They have T.J. Watt. The Steelers don't need a replacement. Fantasy owners don't. There's a Watt out there. But then the final guy is a name that we spoke about often in our previous podcast, our linebacker breakdown. And some of the concerns were injuries, and that would be inside linebacker Reuben Foster.
Yeah, we highlighted there was going to be potentially issues with this guy, and we've already got one. Hopefully you guys were listening and you've steered clear.
Exactly, because it's cropped up its head, and so we'll have to see. I don't even know who they might bring in there to back him up. We'll have to see what the 49ers do. But once again, thank you for joining us for our Week 1 breakdown. We will be back next week where we take a look at what I'm sure will be another exciting week of IDP football.
Indeed, and you'll be hopefully talking to two podcasters who are fans of 2-0 teams. So until that time, adios amigos.